Shalom, I'm Moreh Matan, and welcome to this week's Moreh Minute. This week's Torah portion is called Vaera. It's the second Torah portion of the book of Shemot, which means names in English, but in English we call this book Exodus. In this Torah portion, in the Midrash Rabbah, there's an interesting discussion that I absolutely love. Now, first of all, let me just say that in commentaries like the Midrash, sometimes a conversation happens that seems that it's not germane to the point. It seems like a non sequitur. Like we're going to open this Torah portion and all of a sudden the rabbis that are commenting have gone somewhere. I love this because this is the way that my brain works. When I'm talking about a particular thing, I think about something else that ties into it, and then I go that way. I lovingly refer to these things as rabbit trails, and if you've ever been in one of my Bible studies or sat in on one of my sermons, you know that I am famous for rabbit trails. Now, it made me feel wonderful to start dealing with our rabbis in Yeshivat Shuvu because they tend to go on rabbit trails as well, but since they're rabbis, they refer to them as rabbi trails. So let's go on a bit of a rabbi trail. In the beginning of this section for this Torah portion in the Midrash Rabbah, it tells a story about how the Yod, the letter Yod, actually was bothered by King Solomon. Let me give you a little bit of background. God knew that the children of Israel would eventually want a king like every other nation. He said to them early, he prophesied to them that when you say you want a king like every other nation, at least do it according to these prescribed rules. He knew they were going to cry out for a king, even though he never wanted them to have a human king because he is our king. Well, there is an anecdote in the Midrash Rabbah that comes up about the letter Yod, and this is why I'm mentioning it. You see, when Solomon apparently was copying down his personal copy of the Torah that he was supposed to write and study, when he got to the verse that says, "He shall not multiply for himself many wives," well, here we have a problem. You see, Solomon had many wives, and even more women that he was intimate with that were not his wives. It was crazy. You want to talk about a soap opera in the Bible. The number of women that Solomon had, whether they were wives or concubines, is absolutely astounding. Well, what do we normally do as human beings when we come across something in the Torah or in another part of the Tanakh or even in the Brit Hadashah in the New Testament? What do we like to do as human beings if we come across something that doesn't go along with how we are already living? Well, it's usually easier to change our beliefs to match our behavior than to change our behavior to match our beliefs. I talk about this in the Kosher Pastor program. And so unfortunately, what a lot of people have done to justify their sinful behavior is to say, well, the Bible really doesn't mean that. And I could bring up dozens of examples of life in our society today, all around the world, and you could as well, where people want to justify their behavior by saying, well, the Bible really doesn't mean what it seems to say here. Or perhaps it meant something like that back then, but these are modern times and we have a different social structure and different cultural mores. And so it's just not applicable for today. It's irrelevant. It's an old dusty book, the Bible, and it needs to be kept in the past because we are modern and intelligent and wise and we know how to live. Unfortunately, this is exactly what Solomon did. In his personal copy of the Torah, the Midrash relates that Solomon made his copy slightly different. He changed this verse by removing one letter. By removing the smallest letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the letter Yod, which, if you're not familiar, would look like about the size of an apostrophe in English. It's a tiny little letter. But not only is it tiny in the Torah scroll, it has a tiny little thorn on the top of it, known as a tag. It's like an ornamental flourish. There are certain things on certain letters in Hebrew that are there to beautify the letter itself. So the Yod is the smallest letter, and the little tag on the top is even smaller. Well, what Solomon decided to do in his copy of the Torah is to simply remove that tiny letter. I mean, what could it hurt? It's so small. The problem is, the reason he wanted to remove this tiny letter is it completely changed the meaning of the verse. You see, what it said was that when you get a king, he shall not multiply for himself many wives and turn away from God. Well, Solomon thought, well, I'm not going to turn away from God if I have many wives. Let me remove this one letter, change the meaning of the verse to fit my behavior, to fit how I want to live my life, rather than change my life to fit what the Torah says. This is so dangerous, but it's so tempting. Herein lies the problem. In the Midrash Rabbah, it says that when Solomon removed that tiny little letter, the Yod, that it ascended to heaven before God's throne and said, Solomon is trying to nullify me. I know I'm the smallest letter, but didn't you say that not one letter would be nullified from the Torah? And he's nullifying me, even though I'm a small letter. What if he decides to nullify another letter tomorrow? And then the next day another letter? If we set this precedent, well, someone could just remove many letters and nullify the entire Torah. Where does it stop? In any case, in both of these instances, someone speaks up and says, no, nothing is going to pass away. In the Midrash, God says, I will not let you, the smallest letter Yod, or even the Tag that is on top of you, to pass away. Nothing is going to pass away from the Torah. Isn't it interesting that Yeshua says the exact same thing in Matthew 5:18? Wouldn't it be seemingly wonderful to our flesh if we could look at a verse and say, well, I don't agree with that, so I'll just remove it? We don't have the authority to do that. And if heaven and earth will pass away before the words will pass away, well, I don't know if you've looked outside lately, but it's still there. Let us try to live our lives in such a way that we conform ourselves to the Scripture, not try to twist the Scripture to conform to our own desires and our own notions of how we should live our lives. Let us try to be molded more and more into the image of our Messiah. Thank you for joining me today. I am Moreh Matan from Kosher Pastor. If you'd like to join the Kosher Pastor program, which is specifically designed to teach the concepts of Messianic Judaism to Christians, please go to kosherpastor.com and sign up there. You can also check out our parent ministry, Ahavat Ammi Ministries, and the school where I have studied at and graduated from level 1 called Yeshivat Shuvu. It's a wonderful multi-year program that will give you a professional education from a Messianic Jewish perspective in a yeshiva setting, all online and completely at your own pace. Thank you for joining me today. Let's not nullify the Torah. Shalom and Kol Tuv.